He was reviewing today, but a large part of his review dealt with the first chapter of Genesis about the creation. We have studied about the second chapter, creation of men and women and the institution of marriage. We've studied the third chapter about the sins of Cain and his murder of Abel. We've studied about the flood, and we see in all of that, Ronnie dealt a great deal with the flood too in his class. And we see in all of that the long-term ramifications of those passages as they're referred to back and forth over and over again. I'd like to call your attention to another of those early chapters in Genesis, because I don't think we often see the long-term ramifications of that passage. And if you'd look with me, and if you're familiar with it, it is the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. The whole earth, we're going to read there in chapter 11, verse 1. The whole earth, did I make it up here? The whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Now, of course, you're familiar here in Genesis about the fact that they have just survived the flood. Terrible cataclysm had to have filled them with awe, consternation, dread, as they saw the earth completely recreated around them. And they're staying together, these descendants of Noah, perhaps thousands, many of them. And they said one to another, "Go to, let us make brick, burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, "Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. Let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men build. And the Lord said, "Behold, the people is one, and they all have one language. And this they began to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth. They left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of the earth. You remember when the Lord created us, He created us with the intention that we should be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. Men sinned. God punished them with the flood. And now these men had gathered together, and they had decided they were not going to fulfill that commission that God had given them in creating the earth. They weren't going to scatter out over all the face of the earth. They were going to stay together. They were going to raise a monument and stay together, all as one. And so they had a concept of materialism. The idea that somehow or other they could build a strict structure and a city and a place and not do and as God commanded, and not depend on God. They could stay together. They also had the notion that they were capable of these things. They had the intelligence and the strength and the will to do these things. Theirs was a complete failure to trust in God for guidance. They weren't looking to Him. They were trying to work out their own salvation, which was completely contrary to God's plan for men. And so God came down. They had the notion that they somehow or other, their salvation could be accomplished by their own power. And that became the source of the destruction of their city and their plans. Now, it's interesting, but that failure, that attitude occurs over and over and over again throughout history. It's going on today. God intended us to be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth, and depend upon Him for our deliverance and our salvation. And from the nations that resulted from this confusion of language, God chose one nation as an example of how God intended to rule in their daily lives. He intended to do it for everyone, but they had decided to take matters into their own hands, not depend on God. And so God chose one nation among the many as an illustration of what He intended, and to preserve, as the New Testament says, the seed that was really God's plan for their deliverance. You know, I feel a little bit like that soldier let a man escape because he was too busy. I've been thinking about this lesson, and tonight's, which sort of dovetails into it, all week. And I had planned this great panoply of historical illustration, and I got busy here and there. Yesterday there were just several compelling things that I had to go tend to. So I wound up toward the end of the day throwing this lesson together. I'm going to have to talk to you about it mostly, and not have all the illustrations that I wanted to use to show it to you. He chose Israel, but Israel failed in this illustration. She proved herself little different, very little different from the other nations and from what existed before God had confused their language at Babel. She decided that she would take matters into her own hand, that she would follow other religions, that she would ally herself with other nations to try to preserve herself, rather than depending on the guidance and instructions of God. She rebelled against God's government. Yes, I know there should be a possessive in there. I usually depend on my translator to find all those, but she missed that one. God's government, and she demanded a king. Why? It was to be like all the nations around about her. And when Samuel says they've rejected me, God says, no, they haven't rejected you. They rejected me from being king over them. He warned them what a king would do to them. And it all came to pass. But it was that same pattern of, I don't want to be guided and instructed and taught the way God wants. We want to do it our way. our ways better. So that the spirit that existed at the Tower of Babel had reappeared. It was that rejection of God's instruction and guidance. Then, as history went on, and I wish I could show you all their history, the Assyrians arose up in the northeast of Israel. And they had developed the notion that one nation could subdue many others, and there'd just be one nation. Remember what the problem was at Babel? They just wanted one nation. They just wanted one city. Let's all be together. We'll build a tower. We'll all be one. God didn't intend that. That notion that there could be a universal government of everyone had reasserted itself in the person of the Assyrians. Men would cover the earth, true, but they'd be ruled by one king. And that notion persists to this day. We tried over and over again to erect a universal government. What was the problem at Babel? They wouldn't scatter out and do as God directed. Man alone, the king, would be exalted above God's rule. Now, who had they rejected? You remember what he told Israel when they rejected Samuel, or the prophets, the judges, as God's means of ruling them? He told them, they've not rejected you, they've rejected me. No, this was the same thing. That notion that all were going to be together. The question was, how's Israel going to react? They have this enormous nation up in their northeast that's spreading out into modern day Iran and Iraq and spreading southward. They'd been afflicted by some of the smaller nations around them. They'd been afflicted by Syria and the Amalekites and I'll think of that in a minute. They'd been afflicted by other smaller nations, but mostly there it was simple territorial wars, and God had protected them. But how are they going to react when the Assyrians come against them? Well, they're being warned. They're being warned that they should depend on God, that God would protect them. Would Israel submit to that universal notion of nationhood? Or will they submit to God's notion, depending on Him for protection? God had purposed to save mankind, and He didn't intend to fail at it. He had told them back over in the 3rd chapter of Genesis that He would save them. There was a way out from their fall. God's intention was the exaltation of Himself in doing this. And that's going to be brought about by that salvation of mankind. We'll look at it in a minute. Men had to learn that they couldn't form alliances with one another. Israel couldn't form an alliance with Assyria. They couldn't form an alliance with this nation or that nation and thereby protect themselves. They need to learn to depend on God. They were trying to save themselves. Simple plan. So God set before them on several occasions blessing and cursing. Now, we don't have time to read a couple of these long passages, but when you get a chance, read Deuteronomy 28. Let's right now just look at the 30th chapter of Deuteronomy and read just a little bit there, beginning about verse 15. See, I have set before thee this day life and good, and death and evil. In that I command thee this day to love the Lord thy God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments, and his statutes, and his judgments, that thou mayest live and multiply, and the Lord thy God shall bless thee in the land whither thou goest to possess it. But if thine heart turn away, so that thou wilt not hear, but shall be drawn away, and worship other gods, and serve them, I denounce unto you this day that ye shall surely perish, and that you will not prolong your days upon the land whither thou passest over Jordan to go to possess it. I call heaven and earth to record this day against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live, that thou mayest love the Lord thy God, and that thou mayest obey his voice, and that thou mayest cleave unto him, for he is thy life, and the length of thy days, that thou mayest dwell in the land which the Lord sware unto thy fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to give them. At Babel, they had decided that they could all band together and protect themselves, instead of depending on God to care. Here, he's warning Israel of the same thing. I'll take care of you. I'll protect you. You just depend on me. Look again at 1 Kings 9, verse 6. This is in the time of Solomon. And this same blessing and cursing is repeated here. If you shall at all turn from following me, you or your children, and will not keep my commandments and my statutes, which I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then will I cut off Israel out of the land which I have given them. And this house, which I've hallowed for my name, the temple was built by Solomon, will I cast out of my sight. And Israel shall be a proverb and a byword among all people. And at this house, which is high, every one that passeth by it shall be astonished, and shall hiss. And they shall say, why hath the Lord done thus unto this land and this house? And they shall answer, because they forsook the Lord their God, who brought forth their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and have taken hold upon other gods, and worshipped them, and served them. Therefore hath the Lord brought upon them all this evil. So here they are at a crisis of history. Syria started out up in this area. They conquered all the way down into the Fertile Crescent to two ways. Then they were coming down this way. They overcame the Egyptians, put them into a vassal state. It was an enormous kingdom throughout the Middle East at this time. Israel had to learn that salvation would only come to them in the form of a servant, in the idea of servitude. It's a lesson we all have to learn. If she was to attain life, she had to pass through death. God was going to teach them a lesson. The exile, because the northern kingdom, you remember the northern and southern kingdom? The northern kingdom was going to be carried away into Assyrian captivity and scattered out. And in the book of Isaiah, they're warning of that. And several other, Micah doing the same sort of thing. In Matthew 18, this is the basic lesson we have to learn too. Matthew 18, here I want you to notice verse 1. At the same time came the disciples unto Jesus, saying, who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Jesus called a little child unto him, and set him in the midst of them, and said, verily, I say unto you, except ye be converted and become as little children, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. The idea of servitude, the idea of being a servant, the idea that we are going to have to pass through death, the idea that we're going to have to be born again, that our old man is going to have to be crucified, is the basic lesson we have to learn. And God was about to teach that to Israel. They were going to be torn apart before he would bring them back together. You might notice another passage in Matthew 23, verse 9. Call no man your father upon the earth, for one is your Father who is in heaven. Neither be ye called masters, for one is your master, even Christ. He that is greatest among you shall be your servant. And whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased, and he that shall humble himself shall be exalted. It's a simple lesson. He kept trying to teach that lesson to Israel and to Judah, and they didn't seem to want to hear it. That lesson didn't come with just one session. There were several attempts by the Assyrians, several attempts by the Syrians, several attacks by the Egyptians. Several attacks. God preserved them, put them off, trying to get them to see the lesson. The prophets speaking to them about the importance of the lesson of dependence on God, not forming alliances with these other countries, but depending on God. It didn't happen just once. It happened gradually. But finally, the end came. Look with me in Isaiah 1. We'll begin reading in verse 2. I want you to notice a vivid verse. He says, Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for Jehovah hath spoken. I have nourished and brought up children, and they have rebelled against me. The ox knoweth his owner, and the ass his master's crib. But Israel doth not know, my people doth not consider. Ah, sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, a seed of evildoers, children that deal corruptly, they have forsaken Jehovah. They have despised the Holy One of Israel. They are estranged and gone backward. Why will ye still be stricken, that ye revolt more and more? The whole head is sick, and the whole heart is faint. From the sole of the foot, even unto the head, there is no soundness in it, but wounds and bruises and fresh stripes. They have not been closed, neither bound up, neither mollified with oil. Your country is desolate. Your cities are burned with fire. Your land, strangers devour it in your presence, and it is desolate as overthrown by strangers. Over and over again, Tiglath-Pileser, Sennacherib in Assyria, coming and taking away the northern kingdom into captivity and attacking Judah itself, till in verse 9, and verse 8, the daughter of Zion is left as a booth in a vineyard, as a lodge in a garden of cucumbers, as a besieged city. They took everything except the city of Jerusalem. It was there like a tent in a cucumber field. Everything was gone, except Jehovah of hosts had left unto us a very small remnant. We should have been as Sodom. We should have been like unto Gomorrah. Do you think they learned the lesson? That it wasn't time to, because in their battles, Judah had decided to ally themselves with Assyria. You come help us. Instead of depending on God. Then Babylon followed the Assyrians. They became the dominant nation, and they had the same idea, conquering this whole area. The Jews this time decided to ally themselves with Egypt. Read the book of Jeremiah sometimes. In each instance, they sought an alliance with competing nations. We're gonna join up with this one or that one, and then we'll form a big enough group that we can defend ourselves. Instead of depending on God. That was the problem at Babel. And it was repeating itself over and over again. These punishments were merely examples of what separation from God might mean that are spoken of here in Isaiah 1. The old order was passing, and a new order was coming, and they needed to know about it. Isaiah's intention was to explain to them that this was happening and to warn them to depend on God. There was something better coming that they needed to know about it. And they needed to understand what the danger of Assyria really was. That alliance with Assyria was not the answer. There was no greater mistake than alliance with Israel. Why? God had chosen Assyria to do his work. And that was to destroy that northern kingdom and to virtually destroy the southern kingdom. You might notice a passage or two here in a minute. Assyria had been chosen for Israel's destruction. Look in chapter 7 of Isaiah in verse 17. Jehovah will bring upon thee and upon thy people and upon thy father's house days that have not come, from the days that Ephraim departed from Judah, even the king of Assyria. Ephraim was the northern kingdom, its major tribe. And see, he says, there hasn't been a day like this since they division the kingdom under Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And the thing he was bringing against them was the king of Assyria. And it shall come to pass in that day that Jehovah will hiss for the fly that is in the uttermost part of the rivers of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. And they shall come and shall rest all of them in the desolate valleys and in the clefts of the rocks, and upon all thorn hedges, and upon all pastures. In that day will the Lord shave with a razor that is hired. He's going to use these nations that you're trying to ally yourself with to destroy you. Even the king of Assyria, the head and the hair of the feet, and it shall also consume the beard. Now I want you to notice another passage, this one in Micah 4, the first 5 verses. I could read a passage similar to it, but that's for the sermon tonight. In Micah 4, in the latter days it shall come to pass that the mountain of Jehovah's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and peoples will flow unto it. The change was coming. They needed to understand that. Many nations will go and say, come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of Jehovah, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Jehovah from Jerusalem, and he will judge between many peoples, and will decide concerning strong nations afar off, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. But they shall sit every man under his vine and his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid, for the mouth of Jehovah of hosts hath spoken it. For all the peoples walk every one in the name of his God. We will walk in the name of Jehovah our God forever and ever. Did they have confidence in that? Or were they going to seek these alliances with other nations, not depending on God? Did they know this was coming? These prophets were trying to tell them. You might notice another passage, this in Isaiah 60. Arise, shine, for thy light is come, and the glory of Jehovah is risen upon thee. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and gross darkness the peoples. But Jehovah will arise upon thee, and his glory shall be seen upon thee. And nations shall come to thy light, and kings to the brightness of thy rising. There was going to be a change. God was going to accomplish what they had tried to accomplish at Babel. God was going to accomplish what these nations were trying to accomplish. The unification of mankind. We were all going to be drawn together as one. But they wouldn't depend on God to do it. They wouldn't allow him to do it his way. They kept trying to do it their way. In Jeremiah, the 3rd chapter, let's see, verse 17. At that time they shall call Jerusalem the throne of Jehovah, and all the nations shall be gathered into it. To the name of Jehovah, to Jerusalem, neither shall they walk any more after the stubbornness of their evil heart. That was God's plan. As I said, I'd like to have drawn it out for you in a bigger picture. But perhaps there's enough of an outline here that you can follow through the Old Testament, starting there at Genesis 11, and see man's constant rebellion. That he's going to try his own way. He's going to try to draw men together as one his own way. By power, by policy, by politics, by warfare. Instead of depending on God to do it his way. He was going to send a Savior to them. He was going to raise the mountain of the Lord's house. All nations, all peoples could flow into it. As I said, we'll continue those thoughts tonight. But I wanted you to see, you understand about the 1st chapter of Genesis, and the 2nd chapter, and the 3rd chapter, and you understand all those chapters about the flood. But I wanted you to see the importance of God's plan in the 11th chapter as well. That men tried to defy God, and they've been trying to do it over and over again throughout that history of the Old Testament, even till today. If you're here this morning and not a Christian, humbly become a servant. Submit to him. Go through death. We're buried in baptism with him to be raised to walk in that new life that his Son came to give us. So that we can all be one. So that we can all have the same hope, the same law. Be members of the same kingdom. Come while we stand and sing.